introduce asylum architecture and its use in medical practice?
There's obviously a very long history of placing people in somewhere different, and in terms of thinking about where that place would be, which would be in the early modern period, you would think about private like places you might send someone to. Sometimes local clergymen would take people into their houses, or you have places like Bethlehem in London, which is obviously one of the most famous examples of a purpose-built place. But if we think about purpose-built things post sort of Bethlehem and the Robert Hooke building in the 17th century, you're thinking about late 18th, early 19th century is when there becomes an idea of what an asylum should be and what it should look like, really. And we can see this starting with the York Retreat in the 1790s, and then places like Ticehurst in Sussex, which is one of the ones I'm going to talk about as an example, which is like a late 1790s, but becomes developed in the early 19th century. And these become places that are designed to be therapeutic. So the place itself becomes seen, and the building and the way it's laid out is all part of the therapeutic regimen.
Are there any particularly interesting or surprising features about asylum architecture?
So this kind of idea of the asylum as, you know, the place to take people to as a designed kind of specific space is related to a changing idea and understanding a sort of mental illness and how to treat it. And this is something that starts at the end of the 18th century, goes into the 19th century, and is called sort of moral therapy or moral treatment. So the idea is that you take people from what is making them sick, the kind of environment, the work, the life they're having, and place them in this other, better, sort of, you know, more healthy place. So often on a hill with like fresh air, with views across the countryside, with a building that's designed to keep people, sort of men and women, separate as one of the classic ways it's laid out, but with kind of sitting rooms looking outside, with gardens that are easily accessible. And the idea is that the moral management is all part of this kind of place and the things that you do within it. So things like recreation, exercise, going for walks, doing work outside, agricultural work in the 19th century asylum for men in particular becomes quite important, but also doing work indoors for kind of women. And thinking about the spaces and the way in which you can occupy the mind, try and encourage kind of a therapeutic environment is all based around these kinds of places, and they can be quite elaborate sort of spaces. So if I talk about the Ticehurst prospectus in particular, this gives a real insight into how people were using the asylum and were thinking about it. So Ticehurst is set up by the Newington brothers, who are medical men, in the late 1790s. And this is an 1827-26 prospectus, not totally clear on the year, but it's a way of advertising what is a very private elite asylum. So although they take in some pauper patients, they're really aiming for sort of wealthy young men is kind of their main group that they are advertising towards. So this is for, you know, relatives, parents, people who are concerned, to say this is a great place to send them to. Now, what you might expect is something outlining the treatment they're going to do or the approach they take. But what you find in the prospectus is we have some testimonials like this one, which is from a local sort of dignitary, I think is one of the magistrates, who writes and says that, you know, this is a great place to send your patients to. But otherwise, the rest of the prospectus is around things like plans. This is one of the ground plans of the asylum. So you're showing the building. So what the building looks like and how it's organised is more important really than what they are doing within the place itself. So you can see on here, there's kind of a quadrangle in the middle, and this is the ground floor. So you've got like sitting rooms around it, and there's an exit that goes straight out into the gardens. And it's a really large landscape. And this is really common of these kind of purpose-built asylums, that you have a really big landscape that goes with it, which shows the importance of kind of the outside in relation to the inside of the building. And the sort of the square building on the right-hand side of this plan with the quadrangle in the middle is the asylum. The doctors themselves live in a different building on the same site, but then there are all these walks and garden buildings around it. Now, I say there's an elite asylum, so you're aiming at the kind of gentry, sort of landed classes that understand what a 18th, early 19th century landscape should look like to them. So you have these kind of pastoral images. So here you've got the kind of example that, you know, looks a lot like Kew's White House, interestingly, from a visual perspective. And Kew's White House is obviously where George III went when he was recovering from his first incidents of mental illness. And it's kind of set within this very sort of English landscape. This is what you expect a landscape to look like. But at Ticehurst, they also spent a fortune on their garden features. So you have a bowling green, you have a summer house, the pagoda, the pheasantry. There are 3 different aviaries, so like birds within the landscape are really important. And there is a sense of, walking, of being outside, that this is the therapeutic cure. And as Roy Porter wrote about this, that in this early period of the 19th century, the asylum was seen to be, the place of the cure. This was the therapeutic thing in itself, is kind of the building, the landscape, and how those 2 things operate together.
Can you explain how the design of Ticehurst Asylum developed?
So we don't know whether that main sort of white asylum building was already there or whether they built it. So there's like a bit of a mystery about that. But we do know that in the 1810s, for example, they deployed a load of men who'd come back from Waterloo and the Battle of Waterloo, who were unemployed, to like really design the landscape. So we know there was a real interest at the start of the 19th century in making this the kind of place it becomes, with all these kind of birds and buildings. And then the family own it. It's a family-run business well into the 19th century and into the 20th century, I think. And then it becomes taken over by other kind of private providers and is now part of the Priory Group. So there is still a psychiatric basis, within the place. They still take in patients, and it's still used with the landscape around it as part of what is still a mental health facility. So there's an idea that asylums themselves stopped working or stopped being useful places. But examples like Ticehurst, St Andrews in Northampton is another one, the York Retreat even, are all still operational now as mental health facilities, which suggests that there is some element of having a place to go, of respite, of being somewhere else, that still exists, even if the arguments around who, why, the legal ramifications, how that is organised is quite different.
How did asylum design influence the way that patients were cared for?
So the history of asylum spaces also reflects the relationship with the medical profession. But as the 19th century develops and there becomes a sense of these places providing something particular, that this is about kind of a mental health place, there becomes a professionalisation of the men working within them. So they are seen as alienists, they call themselves alienists at one point, and then become seen later what we would call psychiatrists, I guess. And the building reflects that in that over time it becomes all medicalised with the kind of treatments they are doing, with things they're trialling. So by the time you get to the 20th century, you have things like insulin coma treatments and ECT. And the spaces within the asylum reflect that. So you'll have specialised medical places within it. So there is kind of a sense in which the building and having somewhere where you have a group of people needing a special kind of treatment also helps to kind of create a new profession. This one's a profession for the mind. There's a different thing to being sort of a doctor in a hospital, or a doctor seeing patients outside, that there becomes an identity that builds up around the asylum and that has an element of respect and prestige that also goes with it, because you are in charge of what is a very large building with a great number of patients within it.
What does asylum architecture tell us about medicine and medical ethics?
There are kind of issues around taking people outside of the family and the home they have and placing them somewhere else. So in some cases, this may have been seen, as a respite, as a thing that was really welcomed. But obviously for other people, this is removing them and hiding them away from society. And I think this is always a problem with having psychiatric institutions. And in this case, because the countryside and the rural areas with all these big landscapes was seen as being the most therapeutic place to send people to, because the urban areas were seen as like containing miasmas that cause disease, that they were a much more polluted place to be, and then what you needed was nature, and this going back to kind of somewhere rural. You really are removing people quite a long way from their families, from their communities. And it's quite hard to see what's going on within the spaces and what's beyond those walls. So you're kind of excluding people in a way that feels very uncomfortable and very difficult, and for some people probably was, some people would never leave, you know, they'd be left in these kinds of places. So by the time you get around to the 20th century, you've got these really old Victorian buildings that are in the middle of nowhere, that are on the outskirts, that are seen as kind of warehouses just to keep people in. And I think that's kind of where the problem and the ethics becomes really difficult. And how do you break that? How do you kind of, where care in the community comes from really is the idea of maybe it's better to have people with their families, you know, having them more embedded within society, not hiding people away. Although, of course, for some people, this would have been a proper respite. Their lives might have been incredibly difficult. It might have been very chaotic. And having somewhere where they felt safe, where they could be, might also have been a very important feature. So there's a real tension around how you think about people, how you treat them, where they belong. And of course, now, where we don't have that many clinical beds, it can be that some of the people that would have had respite somewhere like this are actually in prisons, or they're homeless, or they're struggling in other kinds of ways. So it's one of those complex areas about how you think about what people need, what the place is for that, and how that fits within other aspects of their lives.